everyone. I'm Hugo Slim from Oxford, and a really big welcome to you all to Oxford Consortium for Human Rights' first ever webinar. And we were so sorry not to see so many of you in Oxford this year. We hope to have 2 workshops and we haven't been able to. And compensate for you not being in Oxford, we thought you could all meet together online and we would discuss the reason we're not in Oxford, which is the COVID pandemic. So I'm very pleased to chair us all today together for 90 minutes as we explore the challenge of pandemics, epidemics, and human rights. And we've got wonderful speakers, and the webinar is organized in 2 parts. So for the first 40 minutes, we will look back into history and learn from one previous pandemic, Spanish flu, and one regional epidemic. So first of all, we'll hear Laura Spinney joining us from Paris. And Laura will tell us about the Spanish flu pandemic 100 years ago. And Laura's a very distinguished British science journalist, and her book, Pale Rider, on the Spanish flu pandemic is really the best medico-social account of the Spanish flu pandemic. And it's a really wonderful read. It's full of people, places, as well as science, policy, and politics. So Laura, thank you for joining us today. We also have Dr. Joanne Liu from Montreal, joining us from Montreal, who's a medical doctor, who's worked in war zones and disasters for Doctors Without Borders for 25 years, rising to become the international president of Doctors Without Borders from 2013 to 2018. She's now back practicing on the front line in Montreal, and she will share her experience of the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. Laura and Joanne will speak for 10 minutes each, and then we'll choose some of your questions. So please write your questions on the chat line as they speak, and I'll collect some of them for the Q&A session. The second part of the webinar will focus on the world today and the COVID-19 pandemic. And here, our speakers will be from students, activist alumni, and professors in our own consortium community, plus a video from Congressman Jim Himes from Connecticut. So let's get going, and let's start our first part by looking back in time. And Laura, please tell us about Spanish flu and about the connections you see between that pandemic and our own COVID pandemic today. Laura, please, your 10 minutes, starting now.
With pleasure. Thanks, Hugo. So I thought I'd just start with a little overview of the so-called Spanish flu, an influenza pandemic that swept over the world between 1918 and 1921. Infected 1 in 3 people on Earth, we estimate, or around 500 million people, killed between 50 and 100 million of those. So just to put that in perspective, pretty much everyone in this room or everyone in this Zoom has on average 1 ancestor who died in that pandemic. It swept over the world in 3 waves, of which the worst was the second wave. And in fact, the vast majority of the 50 million dead died in 13 weeks between the middle of September and the middle of December 1918. So really in the blink of an eye, the core of that pandemic. I suppose I should add that there was nothing particularly Spanish about it. We know for sure that it did not start in Spain. We actually don't know where it did start, but there are 3 theories, leading theories today, which correspond to origins in China, in America, in Kansas, and in northern France, in a British military camp at a place called Etaples. To give you 2 kinds of perspective on those enormous figures, which is sometimes hard to situate. First of all, the First World War, with which the pandemic overlapped, killed, we think, around 17 million people. And then the COVID pandemic today, which so far has infected, we think, around 3 million people in the world and killed around 220,000 of them. Of course, we're only in the middle of that and we don't know what's going to happen next. So flu is often called a democratic disease, but in 1918, there was huge variability in both sickness and death rates across the world. So if you were, so Europe, North America, Australia in general had the lowest death rates, and Asia and Africa had the highest. If you lived in certain parts of Asia, you were up to 30 times more likely to die of the so-called Spanish flu than if you lived in parts of Europe. And so we know that a number of factors contributed to that variability. One of them would have been host genetics, so human genetics, culture, climate, history of exposure to the flu, and to some extent, though not to a great extent in 1918, public health measures. But the single factor that caused most of that variability, much more than all those others, was socioeconomic status. So if you were poor, working class, or if you lived in a poor country, a developing country, you were more likely to die from the Spanish flu and to fall sick in the first place. The developing world bore the brunt of it. India, for example, lost the largest number of people in absolute numbers of any country in the world, 18 million, we estimate, which is, as you will gather, about the same as the death toll of the entire First World War. Just for the anecdote, in Paris, where I live, 1 in 4 women who died was a maid. And in New York City, which was experiencing a huge wave of immigration at the time, it was the Italian immigrants who had the highest death rates. That was the most recent and the fastest growing immigrant group at the time. Eugenics was a powerful stream of thought at that time, and so there was an idea, especially among elites, that if a certain group of society was more vulnerable to an infectious disease, it was because they were constitutionally inferior. We know, of course, now that that's wrong, that if the poor were more vulnerable, it was because they were living in crowded accommodation, they had worse access to healthcare, they were malnourished and overworked, and so on. And in case you think that's something that's historical, no longer true today, there was a study published about the 2009 flu pandemic in England, which showed that the death rate was 3 times higher in the poorest fifth of the population than in the richest fifth. So it's still true today, and it's will undoubtedly be true in this pandemic. The developing world is likely to bear the brunt of this pandemic, although there may be some slight counteracting factors, like, for example, coronavirus picks on the elderly, and maybe populations in the global south are less old than in the north, and there may also be a slight seasonality effect. We don't know yet. Because socioeconomic status has such a strong shaping effect on the 1918 pandemic, one of the things that means, which I think is quite interesting, is that the optimal public health measures in one place weren't necessarily the optimal public health measures in another. So, for example, in large swathes of the world, schools were closed. And that tends to be a kind of knee-jerk reaction whenever there's an outbreak of a dangerous flu, because children are kind of recognized as the ideal vehicles for infectious disease. But in some places, that was not the decision. And I think it's really interesting where those places were. 2 of them was New York City and Odessa in Russia. New York City being in the grip of a wave of immigration at the time, and Odessa in Russia being in the grip of a civil war. And though those decisions were come to completely independently, of course, the thinking, I think, on the part of the health commissioner in New York was that he was picturing those rooms, those crowded rooms in the tenements, and the terrible conditions that the children in many cases lived in. And he decided that it was better to keep them in class, where he could keep them under surveillance, they could be treated if necessary, and he could also use them to take messages, public health messages, back to their parents, who in many cases did not speak English. In Odessa, it was just anarchy, basically. There was no thought out policy of public health measures. And the one thing that they did try to do was to keep the children in school where they considered they would be safer. The disparities in the impact of the flu did not go unnoticed by the people who lived through it. So the poor and the working classes and colonial subjects often realized that they were bearing the burden, and they weren't happy about it, not understandably. In India, for example, you see just after the pandemic, the editorials appearing in many of the pro-independence publications, where the sentiment that was expressed was, what are we to make of a government that leaves its population to die like, and I quote, like rats without succor in their millions? That was a quote from one particular editorial. So there was a real feeling of disgruntlement. Of course, it had been there before. The independence movement predated the pandemic, but it's quite clear that from the pandemic on, the independence movement takes a new kind of, it takes an impetus from from that disgruntlement and grows quite fast from then on. Switzerland, obviously a very different context, but the population noticed that the rank and file in the Swiss army were dying at much higher rates than their officers. It's a little known fact that Switzerland came close to the brink of revolution in October of 1918, when the pandemic was at its peak. If you look up the historical dictionary of Switzerland under the section called GRIP, you can read that the months of October and November 1918 were marked by an extreme tension in an atmosphere of quasi-civil war. Without regard for the epidemic, then in the ascendant, strikes were called and troops were mobilized to keep the order in Zurich. So there is a school of thought, and there has been for a long time, that nothing much changed in the wake of the 1918 pandemic, that all these feelings and ideas kind of just vanished as soon as it had passed. But I contested that in my book, and I think it's a kind of historian's error in the sense that it took the entire 20th century for us to do the research that showed us the sheer scale of that pandemic. In the 1920s, they thought that roughly 20 million people had died. We now know that it was a minimum of 50 million. So our concept of the scale of it changed over a century, and it took a whole century. And so I think that in the first decades after the First World War, there was much more of a tendency to put all the very profound social changes that happened from the 1920s on down to the war, and not to think of the contribution that the flu made. And I think that's been changing in a couple of important ways. One is that socialized medicine took a huge impetus from that pandemic and started taking off in the 1920s. But another is that many countries created and organized or reorganized their ministries of health, and health started to become really political. And that had good and bad consequences. A bad consequence was, for example, Nazi medicine, where eugenics was drawn into mainstream medical practice. But a good consequence, in a sense, was the idea, which we take for granted today, and I'll end on this, which is that health is a basic human right which everybody should have. We take that for granted, but prior to the pandemic, it would have been a very foreign idea. Thanks very much.
Laura, thank you very much. That's terrific and very helpful. So what I'm hearing there is massive numbers, terrifying numbers, and particularly massive, of course, because the world was a smaller population then. So when you're talking 50 million, relative, it must have been hugely devastating. I'm also hearing that public health has improved enormously since then. So we are lucky with the fact that we have a much bigger science and system of public health now. And of course, the third thing I'm hearing very strongly is that it is still a socioeconomically discriminating thing, a pandemic, because it's not just about epidemiology, it's also about culture, social, economic, status and the way one lives and what one has to survive. So thank you very much for that. And now please do keep your questions coming in, everybody. So please do type in on the chat line with a question for Laura now, if you've got one that's come to mind. And let's now move to Joanne. Joanne, please tell us about the Ebola epidemic, the regional epidemic in Africa that you worked in and that MSF worked so hard in. And perhaps if we could think about the lessons we can learn, because it was very recent, it was really, from 2013 onwards to 16, what can we learn about managing that epidemic that might really help people now, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, if they are getting ready for some of their waves of COVID. Joanne, thank you. All yours for 10 minutes.
Hello everybody, and thank you so much, Laura, for your accounts. That's such an enlightening account. So now I'm going to run and rush and buy your book and read it. So with respect to Ebola, so I think that what I'd like to do is to approach it, what are the lessons learned at macro level and what are the lessons at micro level. But I would like to start with the disclosure to just say, for me, I end up, starting to get fascinated about epidemics, because I do find epidemics a very, very humbling exercise when we try to tackle it, because it has no mercy whatsoever. When it storms through a country, when it sweeps through a country, it basically brings down the infrastructure if they are weak. And there's no mercy about that. And that's what we're seeing right now with COVID-19 which happened mostly in the global north with the long-term care facilities for elders, for example. The weakest point of the healthcare system just got knocked out. So that being said, so in terms of macro level, I think that what is intense, what we learn about is how much we are interconnected and how much our collective security was dependent on our individual security. So to make all of us healthier depends on making each of us healthier. So we had to appreciate that. So even if we don't believe in solidarity, I think that even for personal, I would say, and domestic national interest is still the best way out. The other thing that we learn, and then we end up putting really, I would say, in action is the fact that for the Ebola epidemic from 2014 to 2015, it took a while for the WHO to call up the public health emergency of international concern, and they were dramatically blamed for that, and they're still paying for that. And the reality is, what took us 6 months in 2014 took us 6 weeks with COVID-19. So we did learn to raise the alarm and then to raise it, in a timely fashion. The reality is the world did not react the same, because as much as it was sort of novel in 2014, but since 2014, we declare a PHEIC, Public Health Emergency of International Concern, with Zika, and again with Ebola in DRC in 2018, 2019. And now this is the third time, in the last few years. So it didn't have the same impact of wake-up call. Actually, I think people were much more paying attention when in March, we finally labeled it's a pandemic. The other thing that we learn is what is our global, at macro level, surge capacity? And the reality is it's limited. And it's even more limited when a pandemic is basically knocking at the same time so many countries, and therefore is creating worldwide stockpile shortage of PPE, personal protection equipment, or mask, or ventilator. And then over all the simulation we've done over the last few years, actually, we never thought that the world would be craving for the same thing at the same time. And that is impeding our, I would say, surge capacity. We knew it at regional level back then in West Africa, but I don't think we had, I would say, somehow internalized that. I think that Laura really highlighted very well, how much it's a medical, social, and economic phenomenon, and how much it's basically affecting everybody at personal level. The other thing that we learn is and we don't talk too much about it, it's about the COVID-19 negative patient and being right now the collateral damage of this current pandemic, because we have put in many places the healthcare system on pause and to prepare and then gear up and free some acute bed for the possible incoming COVID positive 19 patient. Meanwhile, we don't have as much access for the non-COVID patient. And so I think the motto should be, no one should die of preventable and treatable diseases. In West Africa, we know there's 41% more death in mother and child in that period of the Ebola. The motto of test, isolate, contact tracing, and treat that we developed in West Africa, and we still repeat today, we learned that it was the way to go forward. But what escaped to us is what will we do when we won't have enough tests? And then we cannot basically enact this chain of command of treat, isolate, contact tracing, and test, isolate, contact tracing, and treat. So this is another point. The other thing that we learn, and I think that it's key, it's how much transparency is key from our leaders. It is so important that we keep that vital, trusted relationship with people in general. Because when you ask people to basically give up on their freedom, it only owes to one thing, which is trust. Because otherwise there's no way people would like to do that. And it's important that you are transparent on what you know and what you don't know. In West Africa, you know, there were at one point, you know, things that were done when the military came and then tried to confine people, to lock down people, and it was not a good thing. Or when we decided to do the incineration of people who died, and we had to step back on that because it was not accepted by the community. And Hélène Sirleaf stood straight and strong and just said, that was a mistake. And we're going to redress that. We're going to fix that. And I think the other, you know, thing that we learned from West Africa, it's some common goods. And then Hélène was talking about the right to health. And then one of the things that came really, really loud and clear from West Africa is the common good of data, the common good of research and development of new drugs, new diagnostic tests, new vaccine, the common good of science that we are developing as we are going along. And so I think the other thing that we learn as well, and goes to the transparency thing, is about, you know, how do you combat disinformation campaign or rumors at global scales? And this needs to be attended as well. On the micro level, there's only 4 points. It's about epidemic starts and stops at the community level. The buying of the community is key, vital. And then we learn it in West Africa. You know, in Liberia, when we were basically begging for more help to come, actually the number started to decline before the international huge mobilization. And the reason is the community understood that they had to change their behavior, and they self-isolate themselves in different villages. And that was a trigger. That was a game changer. Community buying is a game changer. The other thing that we learn is the biosafety of people who care at the front line, in hospital, but as well in public services. And we need to protect them. They are our last line of defense. And if we don't do that, we're going to create basically people who will become a vector of the COVID-19, like it was for Ebola. And it was the same thing at the level of healthcare facilities. We need to have good IPC, so infection prevention control. Otherwise, hospital become an amplification to the illness, to the infection. And the last thing I'm going to end on that is something that's really close to my heart, and it's because I learned it the rough and tough way. It's about dying alone. And this is something that we learn in West Africa, how horrible, how inhuman, how non-humanitarian to let people dying alone, away from their loved one, with cosmonaut wearing PPE, walking around them. And this dying alone, and there's as well the ritual about dying and death. And death as meaning, and we cannot rob people and their community of those rituals. So it is important to do our utmost to not let people die alone. If I'm able to use a PPE, there is no reason that a loved one cannot learn to use the PPE to say goodbye and spend the last few minutes with their loved one. We learned it, we did it. People, forgive us all the mistake we've done almost in West Africa. They never forgive us that we didn't let them be with their loved one. And we changed that. We had to change that. And that as well created trust and created, I would say a much better acceptance of Ebola treatment center back then. Thank you very much.
Joanne, thank you very much. And thank you for that very powerful explanation. And I think very striking to me is the ambivalence of alarm calls. I mean, this awful thing that sometimes people get used to alarm calls with sort of Zika and SARS and things, and they thought maybe COVID's just going to stay over there. It's not very important. It'll die down. And getting that alarm call right for the world is really important. And I think the point about calling a pandemic early, even if you're wrong, is probably important. I think the point about transparency and trust is great, and also the importance of community buy-in. And I think your points on the micro level, particularly the dying alone one at the end, the biosafety is really powerful. And so did many other people. So we've got lots of questions now. You all started quite shy, but we're now picking up. And I'm going to come to Laura for a couple first, and I won't get to them all, I'm afraid. But Keegan Morambasi is wondering, Laura, if there were some effective containment strategies during Spanish flu, and would they work today? Do you want to try that one?
Yeah. So of course, when you're talking about a pandemic, you know, there are so many differences. You have to be precise about which part of the world you're talking about. And unfortunately, the best data we have come from the US, because that's where the data were most systematically collected at the time. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately, because the US, as I think I made clear in my talk, was one of the places that got off relatively lightly. So, you know, we're getting a biased picture from there. But nevertheless, it's useful information. And there was a study published only last month, in fact, which compared two cities, the so-called twin cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, separated by the Mississippi River. And Minneapolis put in place a kind of a suite of public health measures, not lockdown in the way we think about it today, because this is totally unprecedented, but banning mass gatherings, isolation to a certain extent, quarantine to a certain extent. It put in place the suite of measures, and it put them in place early, and it enforced them quite aggressively. St. Paul did not. It was late, and it was a little bit, you know, mosaic about it, put in place some, not others, and so on, and it lifted them too soon. And the lesson from that study, which I think is fascinating, is that Minneapolis had a lower death rate, and its economy also recovered quicker. So, you know, I think there are different considerations with different diseases and different eras, but a number of experts have now said to me, and I think there's some truth to it, that you basically have to keep sight of the bottom line, which is that the costs, all kinds of costs, escalate with the number of cases. So your goal has to be to keep the number of cases down.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's answered the question.
Answered it perfectly. Can I come to William Vaughan now? I'm just scooting down the list, but this is important because this is a political question. And Will's saying, you know, the kind of political unrest you talked about in the Spanish flu, how far did that go? And do you think the kind of unrest we might be seeing even in the United States and that we've seen across other parts of the world about a resistance to lockdown, do you think, and do panic pandemics usually have a sort of uprise element to them?
Well, there is a school of thought, it is somewhat controversial, that pandemics happen at times of social discord, that they kind of, in a sense, unconsciously, of course, unconsciously we're talking about viruses and bacteria, but prey on inequality, because, you know, if you have extreme inequality, then the lower groups in society, the poorer groups, the people who have less, will have a lower baseline health status, and they're going to be more vulnerable, and that makes the entire collective more vulnerable. I think it's an interesting idea, but then the idea is that the pandemic, having happened in a time of inequality, then provokes discord itself, because it highlights that inequality and it highlights the difference in access to healthcare of the different groups in society. You know, it's difficult to look back at 1918 and to say how much of the social unrest that happened in the 1920s all across the world. I mean, it was a time of, you know, deep social tensions, in the wake of the Russian revolutions and so on, was down to the flu, and how much was down to the war. I mean, you know, we may never be able to disentangle those two things. But I think, you know, I think it definitely contributed. I think it inflamed pre-existing tensions. Now, today, we are definitely seeing even some of the same debates, you know, about health systems here in Europe being overtaxed, in America not being properly universal. These debates that, again, were simmering away before have sort of taken on a new lease of life from this pandemic, which is highlighting the problems, those very problems. Now, whether that will lead to social unrest, who knows? I mean, there's another school of thought, as I mentioned, that pandemics are forgotten just as soon as they pass. I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. And I guess it will depend, unfortunately, in very cruel economic terms, on the number of deaths from this pandemic.
Nora, thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah. So it's still playing out, but there's a long evidence base that you get these kind of uprisings and resistance and difficulties. Building on that, Joanne, can I ask you, Lubna and various others have asked questions about the social determinants of health. And, you know, how can we really work to address the social determinants of health, the things that make you more likely to be ill, determine how ill you are, like poor food, poor nutrition, poor sanitation, bad education. What progress can we really make there, Joanne, to make sure that, in a sense, there isn't such imbalance in who suffers in a pandemic?
Right, that's a very good and tough question, actually, because we are absolutely struggling right now. The different organizations who are trying to respond to that at international level. Let me ask it at international from the perspective of an NGO, international non-governmental organization. And the reality is, because now we're facing travel ban, so we cannot move around people. We're facing as well a good ban. We're not allowed, you know, for example, to move around PPE or N95 without a permission. For example, from Europe to the global south. So in that respect, we are quite hampered in what we can do. In terms of right now, there is no good recipe that is being, I would say, enacted in the field. One of the things that people have been trying to do at different level, it's to gear up, is just say, can we protect the most vulnerable people? And then the approach has been what we call the radical shielding, so of vulnerable people. So I'm talking for people in displaced camp or some IDP camps. And the reality is this could possibly work, but you need to be able to have what we call the reciprocity, which is that you need to continue to attend to the basic needs, to access to care, to food, while they are being shielded. And so but it's a bit different of what we're doing. Is we're not only isolating the sick, but we're isolating the most vulnerable. And I'm being very cautious about that, because we fail lamentably in the global north, where we shield the elders home. We just say no more visit, nobody goes, but we turn a blind eye to find out, is it working out? And then the next time we went to knock at their door, people have died, the staff have been infected, and nobody were attending to our elders. And so it absolutely, if you shield, then you need to attend to the basic needs. And do we have enough surge capacity to do that today? And the reality is, many places in the global north, we didn't manage well. And this is why we have more than 70%. Anyway, in Quebec, that is coming from elder homes in terms of death. So I'm sorry to not be to not give you a recipe for that, because we're struggling so much, and this is why we are concerned. And then the other thing is as well, I think it brings the full bigger question of access to access to tools to care. And then are we going to settle to just say, you, the global south, you're going to settle with soap and leaflet about how to wash your hands, and then you won't get any oxygen and ventilator? And it's something that we need to ask ourselves, how much solidarity mechanism will happen when the global south would be hit by the wave of COVID-19, and are we going to come and then and share some of our I would say resources?
Joanne, thank you. There's a couple of people, Rochelle and Elizabeth, have asked you to say a bit more about how you think the global response and the rapid response capacity and organization has improved since Ebola. I mean, you said we were quicker in a sense, responding this time. What's the WHO done? What have states done to make it quicker? What changed after Ebola?
Great question. I think that I think in terms of calling the shot as improved, I think of WHO being the convener of the world, because actually the only place where people have somehow the helicopter view remains at WHO. They have the map, because otherwise all the other countries are so much, you know, turned inwards. They don't really care that much of what happened at the global, but WHO still have that, and they're the one in convening, and they are the one who we did much better in terms of convening platform of research and development, and just say, guys, we're going to do a fast track accelerator of R&D. We need to finance that. We need a vaccine, you know, as soon as possible. Things that used to take 5 years, you're going to contract that time to like 12 months to 18 months. That's what we are asking you. And so I think we've been better in that. I think at ground zero level, it's been very difficult for the WHO or for other organizations, because most of the time it's at national level that the response is happening, and everybody has a sovereignty. So, and since it's been really acting out at more the global north so far, now it's trickling now to South America and other countries in Southeast Asia. But the thing is there's going to be a real question is what and how is WHO as one of those, I would say, international governance medical platform can help and support the HIC, the high income country. And because they cannot come like they did in West Africa with their rapid response team. So we have a healthcare system, it's working. There's this whole, I would say, vessels of care that is working, and it's complicated. So this is where it's different. I think that articulation is going to need to improve, but I do think that on the R&D front and on more the global south, there've been a lot of better response in terms of being a bit the broker of sending equipment, sending guidelines. Yes. Indeed.
It is, as you said earlier, that real progress is in the common good of science, the recognition of collaboration. I'm going to ask each of you one last question. Laura, Rosalind and a couple of others were wondering about mutation and waves. And could you just say, did the Spanish flu mutate? How many waves? How did it sort of change before it disappeared?
So there is good evidence that it did mutate between the first wave, which was quite mild, sort of comparable to a seasonal flu, and the second wave, which was the very lethal one. And it basically mutated to become very much more transmissible between people. But this is where the difference between flu and coronavirus is really important, because from what we know of the coronaviruses, and we do know quite a bit, not necessarily about this one, although this is a sharp learning curve like that, but about the family of coronaviruses, they don't mutate very easily. So we could have a second wave, but if we do, it's going to be basically because of human behavior, because we don't manage this gradual coming out of deconfinement well. And managing that coming out of deconfinement is about understanding that we're in a new normal, and that we can't go back to the old normal yet. We're going to have to accept the wearing of masks in public, for example, contact tracing in some form or other, and even more strict measures if there's a flare-up, which there may well be, in order to contain that and suppress it.
Thank you very much. And the last question for you, Joanne, which is Elissa asking about your point about dying, and she poses the interesting question, do you think we should now recognize the right to die in dignity and the rituals, the culturally different rituals of different death cultures as part of human rights? That's for you, Joanne.
Right. Well, thank you very much for this question. This is such a something that is close to my heart, because I remember telling myself when I was in West Africa and I was working with my PPE in an Ebola center, and I saw a child crying. And I just remember telling myself, the promise that I will never see that again. That was my promise. I will never see a child dying alone with cosmonaut around. And actually, I don't see children now. I see elders doing my shift. And I think that we need to push for that. I think that it's not good enough what we're doing right now. And it's, for me, it's part of the basic human rights of dying in dignity, dying with the loved one, and then being able to pay your ritual. And I think that if we manage with Ebola, who had a 60% case fatality rate, I don't think that there's a reason for us to fail to do that with COVID-19. It's going to be a bit of a production. We're going to need, to train people. But I think people would be willing to comply to what we're going to ask them. And then they're going to be as well willing to just say, maybe it's 1% or 2%. But I think we ought to do that, because death as meaning, it is important for human beings.
Joanne, thank you. And it's interesting, ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, I think this week actually put out guidance on healthcare and death care. And I hadn't seen that formal phrase before, but I think this idea of death care, dignity of the dead, humane treatment of the dead and their families is very important. So I think, Elise, we are seeing progress there, as Joanne is saying, and this idea of death care is very fundamental. I want to thank you both, Laura and Joanne. Thank you so much for getting us going and for giving us such interesting insights into two different, a pandemic and a regional epidemic. I don't know how you clap on Zoom, but I'm clapping you anyway. I think it was excellent. So thank you both very much. And we'll move on. Do stay with us, but you may have to get to the hospital, Joanne or Laura, other things. So thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
We're going to move on now to part two of our discussion. And we've got to focus now on the COVID-19 pandemic itself. So we're now coming up to speed and up to date. And we've got a great lineup of speakers here for you too. And mostly from our own Oxford Consortium of Human Rights community. So we're going to start with Tamara Niella, who's joining us from Oregon. She'll start us off with a global update comparing different policy responses from governments across the world. Tammy's a PhD student in social psychology at the University of Oregon and is also the academic coordinator of the Oxford Consortium. And she would have been part of the team to welcome you in Oxford if we'd all been able to be there. She turned up, and of course none of you did. So she was there for a day or two. The next two people we have is Professor Sujata Gadkar-Wilcox, who will talk and then introduce Congressman Jim Himes from Connecticut. And we also have David Mwambari, Professor David Mwambari from King's London, who both of them will talk about the challenge of clashing rights in the COVID emergency and the very hard political choices that need to be made. And Sujata and Jim Himes will talk about the American, the US context, and David will give us a view on the African context at the moment. Then we have three consortium activists who are either members of our team or alumni who are now actively engaged in different forms of rights work. I've asked them each to open a window on different rights risks experienced by different groups of people under COVID-19. And Glaydon De Freitas will tell us about the challenge for migrants with COVID-19. Professor Susan Dichter will tell us about the experience of students as learners trying to stay learners in the COVID pandemic. And Katie Dwyer will talk to us about the experience of prisoners in the COVID pandemic. And then after that, we'll have questions and discussions for the 20 minutes. And we're going to use the raise your hand function this time. So if you want to ask a question as you're going through, press the raise your hand thing Alex showed you, and your little blue hand will come up and we can see who wants to ask a question as we go through. So Tanny, let's start with you. Give us a quick global overview of comparative approaches to policies and strategies around COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo, very much. So I'll be talking to you about the policy responses across the world to COVID-19. So let's start by taking a quick look at the state of the world in terms of how we've been able to try to stop the spread of the virus. So when we look at this chart and we see the number of daily new coronavirus cases worldwide, we can see that we've been somehow able to prevent terrible scenarios compared to what would have happened if we didn't take any measures. But still the cases across the world keep on growing, and it's still a crisis, which is also an economic crisis and a big challenge across the world. So let's go back in time a little bit, and let's go back to when the pandemic was declared. What routes did countries take? I'm gonna show you a little chart that does a bit summary among some countries of the different routes that have been taken. One option, of course, was to do nothing, and that would be to take the route of the red line. Another route is to try to aim for herd immunity, which is something that, for example, Sweden is trying to do by taking more relaxed restrictions into social distancing. And then most countries are going to what some analysis have called it the hammer, which means that governments implement heavy social distancing measures to quench the spread of the virus. And we can see that at this point, some countries are being able to control their outbreaks through the hammer, and some countries have exited their outbreaks, and now they're in what we call the dance phase, which is when we're able to relax the harsh social distancing measures in a careful way to avoid a second breakout. So how can we compare? Because there are a lot of differences between the measures that different countries have taken. How can we compare this a little bit? So one way we can do this is that we can take a look at the Oxford Stringency Index, which is a combination of indicators such as school closures, travel bans, and monetary measures that are aggregated into a score that help us compare the strictness of different government politics in different countries. So this is how the world looks like under this index. And one question that we might like to answer when looking at this is, whose strategy worked best? Sadly, this is a question that it's very hard to answer because untangling the cause and effect is extremely challenging, in part because circumstances differ in each country and because it is hard to tell how much people can adhere to these measures. And moreover, there are some other challenges that can influence this. For example, economic challenges. Working from home is less feasible in poorer countries, which entails a big restriction towards how well these measures can work or not. And this whole crisis also implies an economic crisis because the economy stops when we take one of these big lockdowns, the inequality grows, and stimulus plans are needed, and especially poor countries are affected by this. But moving on into how we can compare countries and measures, one way that we can do this is by clustering countries into characteristics that they have in common. So for example, these countries reacted rather slowly and with more relaxed restrictions, at least at the beginning. These countries reacted very fast and with very strict restrictions. And these countries, together with Spain, reacted with very strict restrictions, but rather late in their epidemics. United States is a case where it's harder to put into one of these groups because, in my opinion, there is a lot of variability between the measures that different states have taken. But now let's move on to another group of nations, which is the poorer nations. On average, these nations have taken stricter measures than richer countries relative to the severity of their outbreaks. And this might be because they have less developed healthcare systems and they need to act more cautiously, or because their outbreaks started later and they had more time to learn. Then let's take an example. For example, in South Africa, the country quickly sprang into action in March after their first death into one of the strictest lockdowns. And this might be because they're already fighting against HIV and AIDS, which makes them a very susceptible population to the coronavirus. And to overcome all this, they needed a big stimulus plan, for example. Right now, they're at a point where they can lift their lockdown, but still with some restrictions like social distancing and hygiene and wearing facial masks. And if we move on, we can also take a look at other countries that have suffered rather unfortunate cases, like for example, Ecuador, that didn't count with the resources, and because of a certain political context or corruption, or the fact that most of the work there is informal work, especially in certain cities, had led them to not be able to really implement a strict measure, and because of previous economic crisis they were facing, for example, the healthcare system was not ready to face the effects of COVID-19. Some countries, however, are now being able to relax their lockdown. And from what we have learned from countries like China and South Korea, there are three important things that we should do. On one side, we should test massively and trace. And also we should try to integrate social distancing into our everyday life by applying social distancing, physical distancing, hygiene, and public education. So what conclusions can we take? Until we get a vaccine, stopping the transmission is the only defense against COVID-19. And poor countries under this scenario are the most affected because it is also a brutal economic cost. Therefore, we need to study the different control measures and to try to figure out which ones can be removed or relaxed. And this will be key to avoid massive deaths and economic collapse in the future. Thank you very much.
Tammy, thank you very much. That was a fantastic global overview in 7 minutes. And I think it gives us a lot of ways of thinking about who's doing what, who's tried what, who started early, who started late. This very interesting idea of the hammer and the dance, that we're all going to have to, as societies, learn to dance with COVID until we get the vaccine. Thank you very much. Now let's look at what's happening in the USA and in Africa and just dip into those environments and look at these rights clashes that policymakers have to deal with between health, education, economy, whatever. Sujata, let's start with you. And you're going to say a few words and then introduce a video with Congressman Himes.
Yes, thank you, Hugo. Hi, everyone. So, you know, when it comes to human rights and hard policy choices, I thought it would make sense to hear from somebody making decisions in the legislative process. So what you'll see now is an interview with Congressman Jim Himes, who's been working around the clock, really, for individuals, communities, and businesses in Connecticut's 4th District. What I hope you'll take away from the discussion is that we really now, I think, have an opportunity to reimagine what our social, political, and economic systems ought to be. I think the pandemic has created a kind of economic and social deprivation for so many, that perhaps marginalized communities have often faced in the best of times. And what that really means, I think, in terms of opportunities, opening up a conversation about economic intervention, about access to health, about food insecurity. And what we see is that our system is already vulnerable in so many ways, and perhaps we can now talk about how to best address that. So let me play for you this video with interview with Congressman Jim Himes. For me, what's been remarkable is to see local organizations like food pantries in schools and faith-based organizations, service organizations like Rotary clubs, really stepping up to provide a vital need for the community. But I think, as you said, what this crisis has really exacerbated is the kind of underlying, vulnerability of food security for so many people, not just because of unemployment, but because now of really disruptions in food supply. I know that Connecticut has been expanding SNAP benefits, a supplemental nutrition assistance program. What else can we do to alleviate food insecurity and homelessness that really have been produced or exacerbated because of the pandemic?
Yeah, those are great questions, and there are probably some answers that fall into the category of modernization. You know, so for example, there's an ongoing discussion about, you know, particularly given a time where we'd rather not have people jamming into grocery stores, you know, could we change the SNAP program such that, SNAP benefits could be used for takeout, for delivery? Now, there's a whole conversation to be had about that, but the answer to that is probably in some way, shape, or form, yes. And so there's the whole modernization question. I think about, I guess, two other observations. Number one, we're learning that while our food pantry system it's good to have there, particularly here in Southwestern Connecticut, there have been a lot of hiccups in that system. And that's already a very difficult thing. I mean, I've spent enough time in our food pantries to know that, you know, it's a humiliating thing for someone who, and I'll never forget this from 2009, 2010, maybe who used to volunteer in that food pantry, to turn around and actually have to visit it in order to feed the family. So, you know, you already have a fairly freighted thing. Here in the state of Connecticut, and Southwestern Connecticut in particular, like so many of our institutions, you wouldn't necessarily criticize it, but you would say, oh my gosh, you put it under a little bit of stress and it's at risk of breaking down. And I've spent an awful lot of time on the phone with food pantries here, you know, fairly panicked about their ability to actually get the food that they need. So again, it's about modernization. It's, you know, I keep sort of trying to draw the comparison to, you know, insurance or the fire extinguisher that you should be keeping in your kitchen. You know, it's just so easy in reasonable times to underinvest in that sort of thing, to take it for granted and stuff. But boy, when you need in a moment of crisis, you want to have invested such that you know, whether it's a food pantry or distance learning or the ability to deliver you know, cash to small businesses, which it turns out, you know, we didn't do in quite the targeted fashion we would like. You'd like those systems to be more robust than they have shown about human rights. You know, I just know we can do better in the disparities. And you know, as you know, Sujata, I mean, I represent a very pro-business, very business-intensive district. So I'm usually the last guy to do the typical things about beating up on businesses. And by the way, I should say, you know, businesses across the board have been wonderful in this context, whether it's Walmart expanding paid leave for people they didn't typically offer it to, or the banks voluntarily giving people forbearance. But I can't help but notice that, you know, in my relatively short political career, you know, the ability and the speed with which aid is offered to businesses large and small through the PPP program, through, you know, 10 years ago, the bailout of the banks, you know, capitalism is becoming more and more of a one-way street in this country. You know, in the last 10 years, and again, I'm not in the business of beating up corporations. I actually get attacked by folks in my own party because I'm hesitant to do that. I think corporations are innovative, they employ people, but, you know, my gosh, it sort of feels like, you know, just 3 years ago, they were saying, we want our tax rate slashed. And in fact, it was. It went down from 35% to 21%. As a result, we're running massive deficits. But when times are tough, and again, I'm not saying this is like corporations are evil. I'm just saying that the structure is there to support them very, very quickly. And it's sort of a one-way street. They get tax cuts, you know, their taxes get reduced. In times of trouble, the airlines get free taxpayer money to keep them from going bankrupt. And I just think we got to, at a minimum, offer the people, the American people, and in particular more marginalized people, the same kind of speed of aid and consideration that we are constantly offering our corporate sector.
Absolutely. And we saw that with the small businesses too in the first round of the PPP.
Exactly.
And so the small businesses, I think, also drive our economies, and particularly our local economies. So we need support for everyone. Great, thanks everyone. And that was a picture of President Obama with him behind there. I don't know why I'm so excited to see that, but yes. I'll turn it back to Hugo.
Good, Sujata, thank you very much. And it's very nice to have that insight of sort of on the ground politics and choices, and the big message that, you know, we have to prepare always for the bad times. And that means for everybody. Good, now that was a view into the USA and how it's trying to make choices and do this better. We're very lucky to have Professor David Mwambari with us, actually speaking from Belgium, but who is at King's London. And David, please give us a brief view on how things are in Africa.
All right, thank you, Hugo, and all the presenters. Of course, it is impossible for me to give you a view about 54 countries. in a few minutes. So I am only going to give you, just a few things to think about. I can say there are 3 things that we are learning at the moment about COVID-19 coming to the continent of Africa. First of all is that different countries, just like the rest of the world, has taken different strategies. So we have, for example, Tanzania, we have Burundi opting for herd immunity, but they are not calling it that. They have called it more to call people to prayer, like also some other countries have done. And basically, almost the political class believes, it's not happening and it won't affect them. Unfortunately, Tanzania today and yesterday has started seeing a spike in the numbers, and it's becoming more in reality, and the society is getting agitated with the leadership that is very quiet. Already 3 politicians have died in the last 10 days, and that has become a concern because they are not disclosing why they passed away, and they're also being buried very quickly. Now, the other group of countries are countries that have gone with lockdown completely. This is Rwanda, South Africa for a time. I think Tamara explained this, and Ghana as well went into lockdown at the beginning. And then they are all starting to ease, and we have seen their cases being stabilized as soon as they closed the borders. I think the first country, one of the fastest countries to close the borders was Uganda, that started screening everybody who came in the airport. And all that has happened in a very fast, I think, because of alarmist media that has been, talking about COVID coming to Africa. And so I think governments have really, gone on very quickly to start to secure their borders and also to choose different strategies. In East Africa, at the moment, there's a problem because even though Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya has gone on a semi-lockdown, which is basically they have a curfew. They have to be in the house by 7 p.m. and can get out at 5 a.m. the next day. But we see that now truck drivers are the biggest people who are transporting with cargo because cargo is still out to float. In East Africa, for example, now the truck drivers are the ones who are increasing the numbers of COVID cases because it's almost been a month. So those who are infected have been mostly treated, and deaths have been minimal. And so we see we see that cooperation is now even more important amongst countries because you leave one country or one border open and you have a problem the next day. And this is because Tanzania is very strategic for the region. Just like Kenya, they have the biggest ports for imports of food and all other things. Now, as the lockdowns have been enforced, a few things have happened on human rights front. One is that in South Africa, Kenya, and Rwanda and other places, initially there was violence used by some places by the military, others by the police. But I would say that when people started complaining, then government started so changing attitude. This is because some of those countries already have a legitimacy issue or a mistrust between the people and the government. And as a speaker earlier said, this is the most important time when the society should trust the government, when the government should also be accountable to its people. And so we have seen some positive signs. For example, in Kenya, the president himself came out and apologized for the police brutality that had been used. And so we saw it really reduced. We have also seen measures, like in Rwanda, the measures have been really good, where they've been able to really control the numbers and track everybody, test and track. But we also see that, for example, in South Africa, the realities of economic hardships and in Ghana have come in societies where 80% of the people are, working in casual jobs. So we start to see this tension between, a human right to protect people's health versus the economic right, which is a debate also happening in the US, or choosing to do herd immunity versus, hardcore lockdowns like we see Sweden doing and other countries. Finally, I want also to point out that this is an opportunity that African peoples, especially social commenters, human rights activists, thinkers are trying to say, this is a good time for the content to think for itself, because now this COVID has showed that there is a possibility that humanitarians cannot fly in. And so we see more and more communities insisting on relying on local healthcare workers. They are being more appreciated. Doctors are more appreciated. Everybody works in the healthcare industry now. They have seen that this is a very important place to invest. And I think it's a good time also to rethink the humanitarian industry as well as African government to take the healthcare of their people as a human right. I want to go into education. I will just wait for questions and answer. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much. There's some key points there about different strategies across different African states, from sort of herd to hammer strategies, and interesting observations really that COVID is creating a sort of negotiation of political contract around use of force between people and their governments, as in Kenya, but also a reappreciation of African health systems and, you know, localization, developing capacity there. So thank you for that. That's great. We're going to move on now and hear or look into 3 different windows of communities experiencing rights risks.
Sure.
Hi, thank you. So Northwestern Connecticut Community College, it's a small, vibrant 2-year college serving about 1,300 students in Northwestern Connecticut across 20 towns. I'm program director for Team Success Scholars. It's a mentoring program hosted on our campus. I have about 30 students in my program, and all of them face barriers such as poverty, homelessness, disabilities, English language fluency. The program is very holistic and high touch. I meet with them every week for one-on-one conversations, and through the course of that time, I get to know my students very well, and I touch on every facet of their lives. Almost all of them carry a full-time course load, and 100% of them have at least one job. Many of them are helping to support their families. Limited or no transportation, inconsistent internet or cell service, access to healthcare are common conversations. Many are still working at this time in an essential business, healthcare, grocery stores, manufacturing. For me, this pandemic has revealed just how delicate the balance of their lives really is, and the inequity of the resources that many of us just take for granted. The word anxiety is in like every conversation I have with these students. Maddie on the left works in a hospital, and she sees COVID patients every day. Kiersey on the right, her story is all too common. She started working in a nursing home 2 weeks ago, or 2 weeks before COVID hit Connecticut. Her dad and her brother lost their jobs. Mom wasn't working. All of a sudden, with 2 years under her belt working in the nursing home, she was a frontline worker, supporting a family of 4, and we're going to school full time. She asked that face masks be provided for her in late March because she's a diabetic with high blood pressure. And the answer was, we have nothing to give you, and if you don't come back to work on Friday, you're fired. So needless to say, I was able to secure some face masks and shields for her before she went back to work. I have another student who lives in a family of 8, in a household of 8, with 1 bathroom, shares a bedroom with 2 brothers, with only a mattress on the floor. The home is not a safe home setting. When we meet virtually these days, he's ever moving because he has no space to call his own. He picks up his laptop, he leaves the bedroom because he got kicked out. He goes into the living room, gets kicked out, goes into the kitchen. It's not a secure place for him, and I really worry about his safety and his mental health. Asking him how classes are going seems so off topic to what really he's facing in his life. Can he manage his classwork and be successful this semester within the confines of this unsafe quarantine? He has little control of anything that's going on right now, and I just pray. I've supported students with PPE equipment, food cards, gas cards, printer, laptop, helping with rent. I text notes of encouragement. We video chat every week. These are token gifts in the scale of this pandemic, but if any one thing can keep the student engaged and moving forward, then I've succeeded. Nothing in these students' lives is mutually exclusive. Their lives, like ours, are a tapestry of work, home, college, family, community, health, and the balance is fragile for them. Unreliable technology, a loss of a job, poor health, unsafe home can translate quickly into lack of engagement, poor grades, or worse. For them, the pandemic intimately has reached into their lives and laid bare what was already there, the inequity of education for the vulnerable population. Thank you.
Susan, thank you very much for that. And forgive me, everybody, for getting the order wrong. And that was Susan talking about the challenge for learners, and very powerful too, managing multiple shifts under real pressure with the COVID pandemic. Thank you, Susan. We're now going to go to Katie to hear about prisoners.
Okay, thank you. So like Susan, I'm an educator. I teach in Oregon prisons as a community college instructor and also as the University of Oregon's prison education program coordinator. These are photos from a class and then from a graduation that we had a couple of years ago. So I want to talk about the incarcerated community. It's a group of people with a near complete lack of agency over their health. There's nationwide an aging prison population, many mental health issues made worse by the current situation, people with existing health issues and generally poor health care available to people on the inside. And then of course that mass incarceration disproportionately impacts people of color and people living in poverty. And so across the country, prison administrators are saying that quite rightly that prisons were not built with pandemics in mind and that they're trying to implement CDC guidelines and keep people safe, but that it's actually not possible in most institutions. So in one prison where I teach, the inmates sleep in a large room with orphanage style bunk beds, 80 bunk beds with shared bathrooms, shared showers, shared food. And the social distancing guidelines they've been given are to change from sleeping with both people on the bunk bed with their heads facing the same way to going like this, right? So that keeps people's mouths farther apart, but they can still touch the beds on either side of them, right? So social distancing is impossible. And then there's problems and very few options if people become ill. It's not possible to quarantine people very well or safely. In many cases, the only option is essentially solitary confinement. And then that creates, again, mental health issues for one, but then fear among the population that people won't step forward if they do become ill, because that means opting into something that they have desperately tried to avoid for the their full incarceration, is staying out of solitary confinement. So I guess just to say also, I work with people who are convicted of low-level nonviolent crimes, but also with lifers and others serving long sentences for violent crimes. And around the world, criminal conviction does result in the loss of many rights, but also many human rights remain in place legally for people around the world. And I think that this is a critical issue, not just for my students, for other people around the country who are incarcerated, but also for staff members who are going into and out of prisons, which puts their families at risk, which puts the community at whole at risk. People refer to prisons as a kind of petri dish, like nursing home facilities often. So just to sort of wrap up, the New York Times is tracking the biggest hotspots for outbreaks, and 8 of the 10 biggest hotspots in the country are prisons or jails, including an Ohio prison with a 77% infection rate. And so the sort of going wisdom now is that there are likely 2 kinds of prison situations that we're seeing: widespread outbreaks and places where no one is testing. So now to Glaydon.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Hugo. Yes, if you can, there you go. My name is Glaydon De Freitas. I work for Raíces here in Texas, in Houston, Texas, as a head of strategic planning, and we defend, we empower, and we advocate for immigrants in general here in the state of Texas and other states in the United States too. This pandemic situation brought a lot of difficulties for our community and for the people that we defend and empower every day. But today I would like to focus in this very fragile population that are the individuals that are in the detention centers and immigration detention centers. These people quite often are forgotten by the public, by the communities, and we can't, it's very difficult to translate, for example, that nowadays we have almost 40,000 people in immigration detention centers, and I would like to remember you all that immigration detention centers are civil prisons, right? They are there not for committing any crime or any other serious violation. The only reason they are there is just because they don't have a visa or a legal status in the United States. So the 6 biggest largest detention center in the United States are the ones here in your screens, and it varies from 1,500 people to 1,000 people in each of them, but only here in Houston area where I reside, we have 4 detention centers with over 1,000 people. So the population here in Houston corresponds for almost 10% of the whole population. So what we are monitoring there in the prison, and I want to call your attention today, is some human rights in a time that the government and our officials needed to protect and encourage people and to give some a sense of peace. What's happening, especially inside of the detention centers, are very grave human rights violation that we understand, both in the detention facility as a detention itself, the way that they are dealing with the pandemic there, and in the whole immigration system with the due process. Okay, so I listed some of violation. I would like to comment real quick about them. As Katie was saying, solitary confinement now is very more used to put people on quarantine there, but it's not humane. It's not the proper way to protect people put in solitary confinement. Access to healthcare, it's very limited. It was limited before, especially with mental health care. It's very difficult for them to access this healthcare, and now with the pandemics and when we detect some symptoms with some groups, there's no access to healthcare at all. Visitation is very limited, of course, to not spread, but we need to remember that these people are not, they are detained for months already, and there's no access to visitation from families, and even with the other topic with attorneys or paralegal professionals, that we need to meet with them to gather information, to gather documentation, to prepare them for court. So there's no access for visitation at all, and lack of information from them to the outer world to research their cases and to look for documentations, and from us to go into the detention facility and look for information. So it's very difficult. The pandemic brought some problems about due process too. The televideo is used only for the non-detained population. So for the non-detained population, all the hearings are suspended, but for the detained population, people who are in the immigration detention centers, they are using televideos. But we do not have access to the client. We cannot access them to prepare for court or to get signatures for documents or to talk and interview them. So this is it's very critical in our day-to-day work. They are doing arbitrary parole system. They're not paroling people out, even though they don't have any other grave violation. And when they do, it's very arbitrary. We don't know what criteria they are using on that. When now the bond amount to let these people wait for the procedures outside detention centers is extremely high. When before it used to be like around $4,000 or $5,000 or $6,000. Now we can see amounts of $20,000 for people who don't have money. Is already more expensive, and the explanation is because they need to release these people because of the pandemic, but the money is going to be used to secure for the possibility for them to come to all the procedures. So it's very arbitrary.
I'm going to have to interrupt.
Sure.
I'm going to have to interrupt, Glaydon.
Sure.
But thank you very much for that. And you know, from all those, some very powerful points about people's lives and their effects in detention centers for migrants, prisons, and learning. So thank you very much. We are now getting some hands up. So we've now got about 8 minutes, but if you'll forgive me, I might go on till you know, take an extra 5. So we've got some hands up with some questions, and if you feel comfortable with the camera, please put it on, and if you don't, just talk. So I can see several up. Alex, are you choosing, or shall I? Arcadia, you've got a question. Arcadia, are you there? We've also got, yeah, and then we'll have Caribou and Keegan. Keegan Morambasi. So those three first, Arcadia, Caribou, and Keegan.
Great. So my question is about equity in education. How do we use this pandemic as a structure to create more equitable education systems, especially for displaced students who might not have access to traditional education systems, such as children in IDP and refugee camps?
Thank you very much. So we'll go to Susan for that in a minute. So the next question, Caribou. Whatever, I don't know what your real name is, maybe Caribou.
There we go. I was trying to unmute. Hi everyone, this is Kara. It's good to see you all again. My question, I would like to hear more about this political balance of choosing to reopen countries and the effect that it's going to have on vulnerable populations. I'm working on a project in West Africa right now, and countries like Ghana and Nigeria, who had very strict closed down policies, are now opening as of today, tomorrow, and into next week. So I'd really like to hear more about what those outcomes might look like.
Thank you. And Keegan, let's hear your question. That question from Kara is obviously for David. David, you can get ready for that.
Thank you very much. This is Keegan from Kenya, and it's a pleasure to be here. Now, my question goes to David Mwambari, who gave us a good recap of the situation in Africa. Now, my question is, from all we see that is happening in Africa, do we have any success stories or lessons that we can see coming from the continent based on the current policies towards COVID-19? Thank you.
Thank you, Keegan, very much. So, Susan, let's go to you first with Arcadia's question. What can we really do? Because, this pandemic's going to run and run for the next year, 2 years, whatever, to really bolster equity in education.
Hi, yes, thank you. So there's a lot of conversation right now at our college because we are in a rural area of Connecticut, and I can tell you that there are many students in our county don't even have cell service, or it's a very spotty internet service. So exactly that conversation is going on. What can we do to change that? So some of the things we're doing is to change the very structure of, serving the vulnerable population better. Reduction possibly in some tuition costs for some of these students for distance learning might be one thing that we're entertaining. Increasing the infrastructure of the IT, have a better internet system for these students. One of the things that we've done is for some of these students, they don't have Wi-Fi at home. So we actually have bubbles of space on campus, but outside of buildings where they can actually go and get Wi-Fi connection to do the coursework that they need to do. That beside, I think that we have to address the very things that are keeping this vulnerable population vulnerable, changing some of the social structures, the food insecurity, the better access to health, that kind of thing. So that's in the short term, and all of us are really designing a new normal, and we don't even know where that's going to go right now. So
thank you, Susan, but it's good to hear you are, and there are a couple of very practical measures: better access to internet, reducing fees, etc., etc. David, you've got two questions now. One from Kara on sort of opening up Ghana, how can we protect and enable during opening up, and then Keegan's hoping for a success story, probably.
All right. May I? Yeah. So yeah, on the first question, West Africa or Ghana or Nigeria, I think this is a test for leadership globally. I don't think anybody knows, honestly, how to balance it. I think leaders are under tremendous pressure. So they need, policy thinkers. They need, anybody who can come to the rescue to think about the situation as it evolves. I think in Ghana, we have seen even a proactive government. Yesterday, I was on, in a forum where they were engaging the diaspora, regardless if you're Ghanaian or you're from anywhere. They are looking for expertise, who can advise them on how to go day by day. So I think there's a test of leadership, there's a test of policy, and what you're going to see is how open are government to seek for advice and then decide as they go, just like it's happening in Western countries. It's just that economically, on the African continent, we have more pressure economically for people who cannot support themselves. So I think we'll see maybe lockdowns and opening, and when in Europe you do a month, maybe they do 2 weeks. It all depends on local politics and arrangements. The second question, that is equally tough. I don't think anybody can declare success to coronavirus. I think what we can see is hopeful signs. You know, first that we have a population that is eager to find solutions. We have political leaders who are speaking with one voice. Africa Union has already started communicating. They have had teleconferences. You know, in sub-region in West Africa, they have their own initiatives. Southern Africa, they have their own initiatives. In East Africa, and then on Africa Union level as well. I think, you know, and Africa CDC that was established, if I'm correct, in 2017, has been doing a lot of work. A lot of doctors are trying to innovate and not wait for solutions to come from outside, as usually is. Those are positive signs we can look at and enhance and argue for, but success story, until COVID says otherwise, I can't promise you anything.
David, thank you. And I think that first point about everyone having to learn about the dance, as Tammy called it, and it, you know, how we manage a flex down. So we flex up harder sometimes, flex down, open it up. That's going to be the challenge, as you say. And let's hope there are successes. I'm sure there will be. Let's hope. We've got just three more questions we'll take. We've got Anastasia. A quick one question, please.
Yep, one question. I just want to know if anybody, hi Hugo, if anybody has any information on what's currently being done to help with trauma. I know there's a few people, Katie and Joanne mentioned, as well as Susan, that there's some mental health issues that are coming up. So I'm wondering if there's some things to help with trauma and anxiety and what we can do about that.
Great question. Thank you very much. And I know that's really rising up the agenda now in the UK, you know, trauma from lockdown for many people and fear, etc. So we'll look at that. Mohammed, your question, please, as the last question.
Thank you, Hugo. And thank you for everyone who spoke. My question is regarding, I think it's even predated, but it's regarding the future and what we witnessed today with the human rights violation, and we continue to see with the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you anticipate the state of human rights maybe after the pandemic passes, in terms of, we see today the issue of privacy as something that is of concern for a lot of people, obviously other than health, and the issue of global politics. And we see a lot of countries doing a lot of bigger moves, but I think the spotlight of the news today is really on the pandemic itself. So what do you anticipate the state of human rights during the pandemic and after? Is it going to get better? Is it going to get worse? I'm just curious to hear.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mohammed. We're all curious, and I think a bit of crystal ball gazing. I'm going to give that one to Sujata in a minute. So Sujata, if you can look at the post-COVID human rights and politics, that would be good. Have a guess. And Anastasia's question to Katie. Katie, perhaps you can think a little about anything that's going on in your prison network and beyond around mental health, psychosocial. So start with Katie.
So I would say this is probably similar in what Glaydon's seeing in immigration detention, and honestly also what Susan's seeing is that all of us, I think, are experiencing changing mental health situations, but that people who were already most vulnerable are now all the more vulnerable and less likely to have access to even the basics, and that I think mental health care is sort of on the back burner in a lot of the conversations. And just from some of the kind of information that's coming out of many of the prisons is that such as only having solitary confinement as an option for quarantine, that sort of sets people up to be in this double bind situation where they can't make a good choice for the good of the whole without putting themselves into a much more vulnerable position, especially if people are already suffering from mental health conditions. There's also very varying treatment of people from around the country, and people are getting mixed messages, places where the correctional officers aren't wearing PPE at all, and things like that. And I think that lack of information is also deeply traumatizing, and we're all going through uncertainty and a lack of knowledge, but that there is less communication, as Glaydon said, and less information flow. So it should be, and I think it's not.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. And I think it will become increasingly part of the COVID agenda. I think it's got catching up to do. Thank you, Katie. Sujata, take a view on how human rights and the political contract and consensus will change with COVID. I'm thinking, you know, sort of privacy, surveillance rights, health rights, all sorts of things. Where do you think it's going to go? You're our last person, so take a good forward-looking view.
Great. Well, okay, well, let me end on a hopeful note, okay? I mean, putting Mohammed and Dean's comments together, perhaps. Look, I know that, you know, it's grim right now. Things are not looking good. And when it comes to human rights, that may perhaps always be the case, and we always need to remain vigilant. We should always be participating in organizations like the ACLU, like Human Rights Watch, because you have to maintain an eye on that, because you have to watch power, right? And that doesn't overreach. But that being said, I think that we have a lot of potential here. And that's what I want to focus on, you know, that this has really opened up conversations about social responsibility, global responsibility, you know, duties along with rights, particularly in a place like the United States, where everything was focused on these kind of individual entitlements from a government. Nobody complained when $1,200 was going directly from the government to individual bank accounts. I didn't hear the word socialism, which opens up the idea that maybe we did support social welfare policies. And we realized that in an economic crisis, perhaps we need to think about what that balance should be. And now we're starting to move beyond labels. I think discourse, I think conversation and dialogue are really important. And to connecting it to Dean's point, I'm absolutely agree that we are seeing a kind of national and global solidarity, but that, and that is in our collective self-interest. So I want to support what Dean is saying, but that is not inherent. That has to be facilitated. We need conditions, we need an ethic. We need as a community to kind of have the standards, the practices, and certainly the, you know, the access conditions in place for us to be able to work together as a collective community. I see that potential now, you know, because people oftentimes are limited by their own experiences, and people are now sort of seeing what marginalized communities have often faced. And they're realizing maybe we do need to make sure, right, some of these things need to look a little bit different. I think we need to, as human rights activists, we need to work on that now. We need to make sure we're engaging. We are, you know, the new motto of New York, I think, is in a way to reimagine. I think we have a lot of potential to reimagine human rights, both in terms of individual entitlements and social responsibility, global responsibility. I think the time to do that is now.
Sujata, thank you very much. That is a great way to end this. There's lots of hashtags going around, you know, about rebuilding, building back better after COVID, and it's sort of rebuild green, rebuild feminist, rebuild equal, and we can now add rebuild rights, and that's great. I'm going to wrap it up now. We're 5 minutes over, which I'm sorry about that. I really want to start by thanking you all for joining us today, because it was our first webinar, as I've said, and it was certainly my first time to chair a webinar on Zoom, so I'm sorry for the one or two mistakes I made and running us over time. Please do the quick survey. We're all circulating a survey, and please do fill it in, and it'll guide us with future webinars. I want to really say that I found it fascinating, and I really want to thank all our 10 speakers. I won't go through them by name again, but all of them for contributing. I want to thank you all for joining and for coming with us to listen to them and join in with questions. We are, as Oxford Consortium, now going to start working on a series of webinars and seminars, because we need to do that. We don't know when we're going to meet again in Oxford, and so I think, in Tammy's words, we're going to have to dance as a consortium, and that means webinars and seminars online. So we'll start having ideas and putting together proposals for that. And please do send us ideas if you think there are themes we ought to address systematically. We're also going to upload this webinar onto the website. So please do look at it there, and please do also circulate it on social media to others so they can see what we've been doing and understand what people were saying. There's also a list of resources that Alex has put round, and I hope those are useful to you. Above all, before I say goodbye, I just want to say I still hope very much that we will see some of you in Oxford soon, if not this year, perhaps next year, I hope. In the meantime, thank you again for joining us. Take care and goodbye.